And I'm really going to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to give a brief sketch of what apologetics is, so you know what I'm talking about. And then in the second part, I'm going to look at sort of three common objections that are given to the Christian faith. And I'm going to give a kind of brief sketch of how I would go about answering them based on the literature I've read on the subject. Okay, so that's the sort of basic format. And then from there, hopefully, we'll get some Q&As, questions and answers, and we'll go from there. Okay. So what is apologetics? We hear this word apologetics, and as Jenny rightly pointed out, in English we link it to the word apology. And that's not a coincidence. The word apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia. And the contemporary English word apology actually derives from that word as well. This is kind of unfortunate because in the ancient world, the word apologia, or even the word apology, had quite different connotations to what it has today. In ancient Greece, the word apology was used of defence that a person would make in a court of law. Now, a person was accused of a crime or a charge was laid against them, and they would go to the assembly in Athens and they would offer an apology, a defence. They would attempt to rebut the charges that were against them. The most famous case of this from the ancient world was probably a speech made by Socrates. And this is actually recorded in one of Plato's books called, funnily enough, The Apology. And Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth and rejecting the traditional gods of Athens. And so he gave a famous apology before the Athenian assembly. And I don't know how familiar you are with classical history, but most of you know that he failed to persuade his audience and was put to death for those charges in 399 BC. So this is the backdrop to the word apology, what the word means. The word actually appears in the New Testament some 20 times. In different contexts, Paul stands up and gives an apology for the Christian faith. And in various places he refers to an apology for the Christian faith. Perhaps the most notable use of this word is in 1 Peter. And in chapter 3, verses 14 to 17, I've got to put them in a little context so you can see where the words appear. What Peter says there is, he says, "But even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated. But in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defence to anyone who demands of you an accounting for the hope that is in you. You do it with gentleness and reverence. Keep your conscience clear, so that when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil." Now the word translated defence here in verse 15, or if you read the NIV, the word is answer, is actually apologia. It's referring to an apology. And the context is clearly persecution. In verse 14, Peter instructs them what to do if they're persecuted. And the passages preceding this actually have to do with slaves who are being mistreated or persecuted, and wives who are being persecuted for their faith. In verse 16, reference is again made to people maligning the believer and making false accusations against them. And so it's in this context that Peter tells his audience that they must be ready to give an apology, a reasoned defence. And this is to be done to anyone who demands an accounting. Again, the word accounting is logos, which is the idea of a reasoned defence. Okay, so what Peter's saying here is he's saying, look, if you're in a hostile culture where people are attacking your faith, and they're slandering you and they make all kinds of false allegations against your faith, you have to be ready to offer a reasonable rebuttal to those objections. He does emphasise very clearly that it must be done with respect. He emphasises that you must have integrity and you must have character. But, in addition to that, you actually have to have something sensible to say. Okay? It's not one or the other, it's both and. Now the early church actually took Peter's claims quite seriously. And in the early centuries of the church, there's a group of people called the Apologists, who wrote to Roman emperors and Roman governors and what have you, and said, hey, these charges you're levying against Christians are false. And they developed quite sophisticated arguments to rebut the claims being made. And so as a result, the branch of theology known as apologetics was born. And this was a branch of theology that was intended to say, look, what answers, what responses can we make to the objections and challenges that are levied against the Christian faith? Now, fortunately, the persecutions that existed in the early church have ended. We're no longer thrown to the lions or things like But I want to suggest to you that New Zealand culture is still fairly hostile to Christian faith. Christians are often ridiculed and maligned, frequently in the media and in academia and in universities all over our country. I know I went to university several years, so I've seen it firsthand. And I also want to suggest, somewhat respectfully, that Christians have not been the best followers of Peter on this point. Christians often have shown meekness and respect. They've often been very nice people and often lived exemplary lives. But when accusations have been levelled against their faith and have been asked to give an answer, often they've said things that are pretty stupid. They get them ridiculed and make them look really dumb. And I haven't got any signs of evidence to back this up with, but I'm just saying from my 11 years at university campuses, working in philosophy departments and various departments of fairly sceptical people, and then working with the Christian groups on campus, it became very apparent to me that the Christian groups on campus, whenever they tried to respond to the claims that people were making, made a complete fool of themselves. And Madeline and I could probably tell you case after case where we've been invited out to a party at a philosophy department or a student union or what have you, and we've sat down and we've had really good discussions with people who will not discuss the gospel with Christians because they think they're stupid. They're actually interested. They're actually fascinated, but they think Christians don't have anything to say. They acknowledge that Christians have good character and good integrity, but they can't relate to people who are nice but have no brains in their mind. And that's how they see it. I'm not saying they're correct, but that's how they see it. In other words, it's still important that you have something to say. Okay, so that's an introduction to what apologetics is. So let's look at the second part, which is objections to the Christian faith. Now, before I get into the objections, I just want to talk a little bit about the stance that I think is often useful to take towards objections that are raised against the Christian faith. And I was really quite surprised and somewhat encouraged when I read a book by a guy called Timothy Keller, who actually articulated quite clearly the kind of thing that I myself have noticed. And this is what Timothy Keller writes in Doubt. He says, all doubts, however sceptical and cynical they may seem, are really a set of alternative beliefs. You cannot doubt belief A except from a position of faith in belief B. The only way to doubt Christianity rightly and fairly is to discern the alternative belief under each of our doubts and then to ask yourself, what reasons do you have for believing it? How do you know your belief is true? And here's the key point. It would be inconsistent to require more justification for Christian belief than you do for your own. But that is frequently what happens. In fairness, you must doubt your doubts. My thesis is that if you were to come to recognise the beliefs in which your doubts about Christianity are based, and if you were to seek as much proof of those beliefs as you expect Christians to give for theirs, you will discover that your doubts are not as solid as they first appear. You see Keller's point there? I hope you grasp it because I think it's fairly vital. Keller notes that when you doubt, when somebody doubts, if it's not just an arbitrary I doubt for the sake of it, it's usually based on some idea, some belief, some value that they have. And so, one of the problems I think Christians have made have been too quick to try and answer the purported question rather than say, hey, what's in the background here? What's the belief driving this person's doubt? And then ask the question, are they willing to apply the same sceptical standard to the beliefs that undergird their doubts as they are to Christianity? And frequently, I think you'll find that people don't. And this is often a really useful way of responding and getting them to start reconsidering their position in the Christian faith. So with that in the background, I'm going to look at three basic objections to the Christian faith that are commonly raised. The first one I'm going to look at is that it's irrational to believe things that cannot be proven. Okay? This is really, really common. I think I did my master's thesis on this position. But anyway.